How do you start trusting after you've been burned? I was in love. She was my wife, and I considered her my best friend. Debbie and I had been married for 6 years when I found out it was all an illusion. We were living in Portland at the time. Debbie had recently taken a job as an internal auditor for the city's largest real estate firm, and I was in sales for a national machine tool company. Given my product line, I was rarely downtown. Most of my customers were in the suburbs or outlying areas of Western Oregon. But on this day, I found myself in the city with 2 extra hours on my hands. I called Debbie, invited her to lunch, and was disappointed when she told me she needed to finish a spreadsheet before an important meeting in the afternoon. I didn't want to miss the opportunity, and headed over to Jake's to have a bowl of their crawfish etouffee. I enjoyed the nutty brown rice sauce while listening to the conversation of the ladies at the table behind me and wondering how they did it. All 4 women seemed to be talking at the same time. It wasn't the first time I'd observed this phenomenon, and it always puzzled me. Men can't do that. I was sitting there smiling to myself, trying to figure out how anyone could understand this gibberish, when the words of one of the women came into my head. I wasn't the only person intrigued by this lady's question, because the other 3 women at the table immediately fell silent. So Deborah Miller is doing the dirty deeds with Simon Walker? This question caught my attention because my wife's first name is Deborah. She uses that name in her professional life. Only family and friends call her Debbie. And Miller is the last name she's had with me since we got married. I'm Mark Miller, by the way. One of the ladies asked, "Why, how do you know?" The first one replied, "I was sitting in Deborah's office when her husband called her. She declined his invitation, making the excuse that she was working on her lunch hour. 5 minutes later, Simon peeked into her office and asked if she was ready to go out. She nodded her head to Simon and then blushed as she looked back at me, obviously embarrassed that I had heard her lie to her husband. My heart dropped at those words, but I listened while the other ladies continued to gossip. It didn't take Simon long to sink his fangs into another married woman, did it? Deborah's only been in the office for a month. And it's only been 2 months since Heidi Johnson quit. I heard that her husband forced her to quit after finding out about her affair with Simon. Can you imagine a mother with 2 preschoolers falling for Simon's lying tricks? What's his secret? You mean besides those big blue eyes, Ryan Gosling's face, and from what I hear, a rather large package downstairs? All 4 women started laughing. I had heard enough, so I paid the bill in cash and walked out to my car. The rest of the day passed like a blur. I tried to figure out how I could confirm my worst fears. If Debbie was having fun with this jerk, we were screwed. So now, do I hire a private investigator to follow her, or are there other means to accomplish this goal? Out of curiosity, I called Debbie's office and pretended to be a salesman. The receptionist kindly informed me that Miss Miller had stepped out and would be back at 2 o'clock. Just like that, I hoped the gossip was unfounded. When Debbie got home that evening, I tried my best to act normal, although I almost snapped when she apologized for not being able to have dinner with me. She even had the nerve to kiss me on the cheek as she apologized. She asked if I would mind if I made dinner because she wanted to lounge in the tub for a while before we sat down to dinner. She poured herself a glass of wine and headed into the master bath. It was probably her way of getting rid of the evidence. Going home and taking a shower would be too obvious. Debbie was smart enough to use the bathtub as a disguise. How many more nights would she use this ruse? I quickly prepared a salad and a tray of cheese and crackers, then headed for the bathroom. Mark, are you trying to scare me to death? Well, if you remember, Deb, I live here too. Debbie has a knack for talking when she's lying or needs time to answer a question. She doesn't know she has it, and I've never told her about it. Every once in a while, I notice it, like last week when a good friend of ours asked Debbie if she liked her new hairstyle. Debbie blinked twice, and then told her friend that she absolutely adored it. Before answering me, Debbie said, "I just went out because I'm absolutely ravenous. Is dinner ready?" You may have guessed that another of Debbie's specialties is her use of words like absolutely. Catching Debbie turned out to be incredibly easy. That evening, I downloaded a book to my Kindle called The Amateur Detective, Catching a Cheating Spouse. It only took me a couple hours to read it in outline, and the next morning I completed 2 tasks while Debbie was in the shower. First, I checked Debbie's calendar on her smartphone. At noon yesterday, Debbie had allotted 2 hours marked working through lunch. I noticed that the previous Thursday she had the same 2 hours allocated with the same notation. How clever of her. The second task was to download a tracking app on her phone. That was too easy, and after thinking about it, I checked my phone. Son of a bitch, my phone had a similar app on it. I quickly deleted the app from Debbie's phone. I shouldn't have broached the subject too soon. I saved the app on my phone. It might come in handy later. You've read stories about guys acting normal while waiting for proof of a cheating wife, but you can't believe how difficult it is until you try it yourself. For the next 5 days, I tried my best to be a loving husband. Every morning I checked her calendar. Tuesday morning proved to be a good day. Between noon and 2, there was a notation, working until lunch. After breakfast, I drove to my office and did my best to get at least something done in time. On the way to work, I bought a drop phone at Walmart. At 11 o'clock, I forwarded my regular phone to the new drop phone and left the regular phone on my desk. If Debbie checked the tracking app she had installed on my phone, she would see that I was 20 miles from her office. If she called me, I could answer the call from my regular phone. I made the 15-minute drive downtown and got a seat at the Starbucks across the street from her office building. Right at noon, she walked out the door with a man. Hell, he looked like Ryan Gosling. I walked out of the Starbucks and followed them. It may seem trivial, but following the advice in the book, I put on a baseball cap, sunglasses, and put a small rock in my right shoe to change my gait. None of this mattered because the couples in love were only paying attention to each other as they walked hand in hand across the block to the lobby of the Vintage Hotel. I figured I had almost 2 hours, so I walked across the street to the bank and started transferring money, closing our joint credit card accounts and home equity. Debbie and I also had credit cards in each of our names. She wouldn't find out about the closed accounts until it didn't matter. I also called my company's law firm and got a recommendation for a divorce attorney, called her office and made an appointment for the next day. Half an hour later, I was back in the hotel lobby. I waited in the lobby, trying to act inconspicuous, pretending to read the Wall Street Journal and actually watching the elevator doors as the two of them went downstairs. I stood up. Debbie. Debbie stared at me with a shocked expression on her face. Mark, God, no! Simon was ready to play the hero because he stepped between Debbie and me and started saying something about being careful, sticking out his hand like some damn traffic cop. Apparently, Debbie forgot to tell him about the boxing class I was taking because he didn't seem to be prepared when my fist entered his belly just below the solar plexus. He went down and even wet himself. Debbie just stood still, continuing to move her mouth like some damn fish. Before she could get a word out, I told her, "You can keep your room for the night, because I don't want you coming home tonight and probably ever again." Unfortunately, right after I got home that day, a patrol car pulled up, and when I opened the door, I was handcuffed and taken to the Multnomah County Jail and charged with assault. Simon pressed charges. I ended up spending the night in jail, and the next day I was released for reconnaissance. When I got home, it was clear that Debbie was in the house because almost all of the small and valuable items, including the watch my father had left me after his death, had been put away. I checked the closet, and Debbie's clothes were gone too. Good riddance. I still had time to shower and make it to my meeting with my lawyer in time. Over the next 3 months, the following happened, in no particular order. The charges against me were dropped because I was lucky that the clerk at the front desk told the police that Simon had attacked me, and she saw him raise his hand. She thought he looked like he was ready to attack me. I guess she was the kind of person who is happy to see any skunk who entertains a married woman get his just reward. She wasn't really lying, just interpreting Simon's actions in my favor. I only communicated with Debbie through our attorneys. She tried to strike up a conversation along the lines of, "Can we make this work?" I firmly answered no, and the divorce papers went through the system. When I refused to agree to counseling, Debbie became furious and tried to get half of our joint property, alimony, etc. After Debbie, I was lucky because my attorney argued that even though we lived in a no-fault state, I should not have to suffer the consequences of her actions. The judge was swayed by this. My attorney took a unique approach. She argued that while Debbie had the option of writing her own vows, she had agreed to the traditional vows, which included forsaking all others, so I should expect fidelity. Second, we had testimony from Debbie's coworker about a conversation in Debbie's office when she declined my lunch invitation to have lunch with Simon. Third, and you could have heard a pin drop when this was brought up in court, Debbie had removed my father's watch while I was in jail. The judge tried her best to keep a neutral expression on her face as she listened to this testimony, but it clearly made an impression on her. Even Debbie's attorney shuddered when this statement was read in court. I got my divorce and my watch back. Debbie and I split everything we had accumulated during the marriage, and she received no alimony. Debbie asked for one more thing, and it was granted. She asked to meet with me before the final papers were signed, sealed, and delivered. What the heck? I agreed, at least out of curiosity. So, we sat down at her lawyer's office, and she started talking shit about how much she loved me, how sorry she was for falling into Simon's trap, and how she thought we were a great couple with a great future. When I'd heard enough, I decided to bluff. Debbie, tell me about the others. Debbie blinked twice before answering. Mark, in all the time we've been together, I've never been with anyone else. I shook my head. Goodbye, Debbie. That must have really pissed Debbie off because 3 weeks later, I received a CD in the mail. It was hard to believe. I always thought Debbie was a pretty smart woman, but on the disc was a recording of Debbie and Simon. I put the video on the website. The site racked up a couple hundred views and lots of likes every day until I deleted it. I seriously considered sending links to the site to Debbie's parents, friends, and employer, but in the end, I decided to ease up. I never told Debbie about it, but I did send her an email warning her that if similar videos appeared on her father's computer screen. Debbie responded with an apology and an unconvincing explanation that she was still hurt by the way things ended and was trying to make me jealous. She promised to stop. I'm a pretty stoic guy. I'm sure most people who know me think I'm even a little cold. After the divorce, and even after watching the video, I didn't cry, get drunk for a week, or think about eating my gun. I was sad, after all. Debbie was my best friend for the 6 years we were married. Her betrayal stripped me of all trust in other people. If you start to think that people aren't trustworthy, you start to see it in your everyday interactions with people. I'm pretty sure they called it a self-fulfilling prophecy in college psychology classes. Now, when a bartender or salesman would give me change from a 10 instead of a 20, I thought they were trying to cheat me. Little things like that turned me into a cynic. My job in sales didn't help either, because it's such dog food. As for women, I had the usual routine of chasing skirts and hanging out in bars. A lonely existence. Until I met Becky. A year after my divorce, I met Becky at a dinner party my clients had thrown. Becky was beautiful. Green eyes, blonde hair, a body that belonged on the cover of a Victoria's Secret catalog, and best of all, the personality of a woman you would be proud to take home to introduce to your family. Her smile and laughter could light up a room, and they certainly lit me up. At that dinner party, I did my best to be the most charming and most interesting man in the world. I could have sold Mexican beer that night. All that was left was to sell myself to this lady. As we were about to end the evening, I approached Becky and asked if I could take her out to dinner next weekend. How could I say no? She asked. You've worked so hard tonight to make me want to say yes, and that effort should be rewarded. Is that obvious? Yes, but I think it's nice. I also asked our hostess what she thought of you, and she said you have potential, so let's go out next Friday and figure it out. After 2 months of dating, we decided to become exclusive, but we didn't rush things. We lived separately, although we did spend 4 or 5 nights a week together. Every one of my friends fell in love with her. What's most interesting is that I was starting to fall in love with Becky and felt she might fall in love with me. Yes, I was starting to think this could be my ticket to happiness, but then the bottom fell out. My clue that something was wrong came one day when Becky and I had taken the afternoon off and were sitting down for a beer. Becky's phone rang. She looked at the display and ignored the call. That wasn't like her. She usually answered the phone and said she would call back later. After not knowing what to do with Debbie, I became more observant and suspicious. I wasn't about to play the role of the happy cuckold again. And then later that evening, I had the opportunity to grab her phone and go through her call list. At 3:30, she missed a call from a man listed in her contacts as JR. Looking through the call log, I found several conversations between the two. I then looked at Becky's calendar and found that she had a meeting scheduled with JR for 1 p.m. the next day. Time to look for my baseball cap, sunglasses, and shoe rock again. Thursday afternoon, I was at the sandwich store across the street from Becky's office building. She left the building alone and headed north on Broadway before entering the Marriott. Just as I entered the lobby, Becky and a man walked up to the front desk and spoke to the desk clerk. I couldn't believe my eyes. How could this be happening to me again? I almost threw up as I approached them. You cheating, lying bitch? Becky turned around and looked at me. I don't think the look on her face would have been any different if I had shot her with a gun. The man she was with looked at me and asked, "Who's that?" Before Becky could answer his question, a second man with a Marriott badge approached. He stared at the three of us in confusion, but before anyone could say a word, Becky ran out of the lobby. It all happened too fast, but I managed to read the second man's name tag. Greg Houston, catering manager, and then looked back at the first man. The first man broke the silence. I understand you are Mark. I'm John Riley, the man Becky hired to coordinate your surprise 30th birthday party here at the Marriott. I think you just blew it. After that day, Becky never returned my calls again. A week later, I woke up to find a box on the front porch of my townhouse containing the items I had left at her apartment. Inside was a note that read, I don't need anything I left at your house. Give it all to charity. Becky. For the next 6 months, I sank into depression. I ate, slept, and went to work. One afternoon, I decided to go and attend the annual Portland Craft Beer Festival on the riverfront. As luck would have it, I ran into Becky there. She was with a guy, and they were clearly a couple. After introducing us, Becky asked him if she could have a word with me. To his credit, her boyfriend agreed. Mark, I'm sorry I didn't talk to you again, but I was so hurt and angry at that moment. I called my mom that night, and she told me you were damaged goods and that I should run. I took my mom's advice and left you alone. Becky, I wish I could be mad at you for the way things ended, but unfortunately, I think your mom is right. Debbie's betrayal hurt me more than I could have ever imagined. I'm sorry I called you names in the hotel lobby. You didn't deserve it, and I was an ass. Mark, get help. You're too good a person to live the rest of your life alone because one man violated your trust. Find someone who can help you, whether it's a psychologist, a priest, or whoever. I'm sorry I wasn't the right person to make you whole again. We almost had something. Thanks for the advice. I think you're right. I need to get a grip. Thank your boyfriend for giving us a chance to talk. You deserve a guy who trusts you enough to do that. Say hi to your mom for me and tell her what I said. She raised a beautiful woman and her instincts were right. We stepped away from each other, and I saw the moisture in her eyes. I had to quickly look away before she saw my tears. So where to go when I need to rebuild and get my life back on track? Where I should have gone when my marriage fell apart. I took 3 weeks of vacation and headed home to Chicago. Time to play prodigal son. My mom still lived in the house where we grew up, on the north side of town. I was the only one of her children to move out of the neighborhood, so she wasn't lonely. My older sister had 2 children, and my younger brother had 3. I teased him that his wife was a regular baby-making machine, 3 children before his 30th birthday. With 5 grandchildren around, Mom stayed busy, but I knew she missed having me around, though I can't imagine why. since she always claimed I was the cause of her gray hair. On my second day in town, Mom invited my siblings and their families over for a big holiday meal. She served my favorite dish, homemade lasagna, and my favorite dessert, chocolate cheesecake. Like I said, it was like the prodigal son. I pretended to be the lost uncle and gave each of my nieces and nephews some expensive electronic gift that most of them were too young to use. You could see my parents rolling their eyes at my stupidity, but I think they appreciated my sentiments. After everyone left, my mom and I did the dishes together and were able to chat. Mom didn't like to give advice. That was always Dad's job. But Mom always knew what to do. Your buddy Hank Taylor still stops by from time to time. He asks how you're doing. When was the last time you two talked? Not as often as I should, and before you say it, yes. It's probably my fault we don't talk more often. Call him. Hank was my best friend from the time we met in kindergarten until I left for college. From K-12, we were inseparable. In Little League, he was the pitcher, and I was the catcher. In soccer, for 6 years, he was the quarterback, and I was the receiver. I quit baseball my freshman year because I was a mediocre hitter at best, and the track coach noticed in gym class my ability to pole vault and high jump. I quit soccer after my junior year because my father was worried that I would get injured and lose my chances at a college athletic scholarship. As a junior, I was one of the best pole vaulters in the country, and the University of Oregon was ready to recruit me. My father's decision to keep me out of soccer had a negative impact on Hank's life. In my junior year, our soccer team fell just short of making it to the state championship. Much of our success was due to the Taylor-Miller combination. I was Hank's no-one target. His senior year was a bust. Most receivers had glass hands, and his stats weren't good enough to get him a scholarship to college soccer, his first love. He did, however, get a scholarship to play baseball at Southern Illinois and did quite well. Hank knew my father and his influence on my decision. He never resented me for quitting soccer. I ended up at the University of South Africa and was raring to go to the Olympics when an accident ended my career as a pole vaulter. During warm-ups at the NCAA finals, my pole broke in two, a once-in-a-million occurrence. I fell at an awkward angle and shattered my knee so badly that it took me 2 years of therapy to get back to 90% capacity. By then, the Olympics were over, and I had earned my bachelor's degree. I also had $250,000 in the bank after the pole manufacturer settled. In case you're wondering, Debbie couldn't touch the $250,000. Dad insisted on a prenup. When I went to Oregon State and Hank went to SIU, we started drifting apart. I was one of his suitors when he married Janice, and came home for the last time after Janice gave birth to their second son. It had been a little over 2 years since I'd last seen Hank, and if he was angry at my inattention, he didn't show it. 30 minutes after I called him at his house, we were sitting in the backyard drinking beer. First, I learned what was going on in Hank's life. His job, firefighter in Chicago, his wife, Janice, and his 2 boys, Mark and Hank. Then it was my turn. Hank learned of my divorce from my mom, but she didn't share any details. He was less surprised by these events than I had anticipated. He was surprised when I told him how my relationship with Becky ended and how I had trust issues. After Debbie cheated on me, I have a hard time trusting anyone. It seems like it's every man for himself. Hank gave me a hard look before answering. That's because you've been hanging out with the wrong people for the last 12 years. Let me tell you a story you don't know. All 3 years that you and Ginny dated in high school, I was in love with Ginny. Yes, I can see by the look on your face that you didn't have a clue about anything, and that's the way it should be. A friend never messes with a friend's girlfriend, no matter what. Remember that trip to my uncle's cabin in Door County? You had to work on Friday, and so did the girl I went with then, Stacy. Ginny and I went to the cabin Friday morning to get everything ready, and you and Stacy were going to come over Friday night after work. Your car broke down, and you didn't get there until late Saturday night. Ginny and I are alone all night because we got a call saying you're stuck in Milwaukee, we're drinking cheap wine. Ginny is still in one of her bikinis after swimming in the lake, And to top it all off, the power went out at the cabin. So now we're sitting by candlelight. And you want to know what happened that night between me and Ginny? Nothing. Because a friend would never cross that line. And if I hadn't been a friend and tried to hit on Ginny, do you know what would have happened? Nothing. Because Ginny was the kind of friend who would never cheat on her man. You went to Oregon and left the people you could count on to follow your Olympic dream. That's okay, but you shouldn't have replaced your friends with self-centered hacks pursuing their own goals. I feel sorry for you, Mark. It took me a few moments to realize what Hank had said. Then I thought of Ginny. You don't know where Ginny is or what she's doing? I haven't seen her since the first Christmas I came home my freshman year in Oregon. We practically broke up that week. Another long-distance affair. It didn't help that I went to Delta and the sorority girls were easy. Ginny was here a couple months ago. She's now a widow with a 5-year-old son. A widow? What happened? Her husband last served in Afghanistan. He got shot. She didn't go into details, but I understand he received some important medals for bravery, unfortunately posthumously. Ginny is trying to hang on for their son's sake, but you can tell she's barely hanging on. She still lives in San Diego County, not far from the base, and his co-workers keep an eye on her. She'd probably love to hear from you if you want to know her email. Is she still hot? Did anything happen between you two while she was in town? I glanced over my shoulder to make sure Janice couldn't overhear our conversation, but the storm door was closed. You weren't listening to Mark. What the hell happened to you? For one thing, I would never cheat on Janice. For another, Jeannie would never do it with a married man. It's just not what we both are. You need to get your head out of your ass. Only Hank Taylor could talk to me like that. That evening, I sent an email to Ginny. Jeannie, Hank Taylor gave me your email address. I hope I don't feel it's inappropriate to contact you, but I'll be in the San Diego area this weekend and was wondering if I could take you and your son out for lunch or dinner Friday or Saturday. Just to catch up with you. With warm wishes, Mark. Early Tuesday morning, I received a reply to my email with a pleasant surprise. Mark, how nice to hear from you after all these years. Lunch on Friday will suit me and my son Kevin. My address is XX. I will expect you at noon unless I hear from you otherwise. Your friend, Jeannie. Hank had been on duty since Tuesday, which meant he'd be at the fire station until I left town. But he invited me to tour the station and have lunch with his crew. I accepted his offer, and later that day sat at a table with a whole host of characters. Blacks, whites, Hispanics, men and women. I still have a hard time explaining the feelings I had sitting between two of Hank's fellow firefighters. They were both willing to answer my questions. They were probably used to civilians being in awe of what they considered routine. It became apparent how much trust is needed to accomplish their tasks while fighting a fire. Each firefighter could only enter a burning building knowing that their teammates would have each other's backs and do their job. I guess that's when I started to realize when my life started to go off the rails. Back in high school, I replaced baseball and soccer, two team sports, with individual track and field events. While the overall performance of the track team depended on others, my contribution depended solely on my effort. Even my chosen profession, salesman, was similar to this. Whether or not I made a sale depended almost entirely on my efforts. The only teamwork I could point to since I turned 15 was my marriage to Debbie. Could my failed marriage be partly to blame for my selfishness, or the fact that I married a woman with selfish traits similar to my own? Semper Fidelis. On Thursday, I flew to San Diego, rented a car, and checked into the Coronado Hotel. On Friday, I drove north to Ginny's house, one of 4 apartments in a 4-story townhouse. I rang the bell and waited, trying to hide the bouquet of flowers from the eyes of a curious neighbor. I almost dropped the flowers when the door opened. My God, Ginny was even more beautiful than she had been in her 19 years. She was dressed in a bright blue sundress, and a little boy was wrapped around her legs. Mark, welcome. She put her hands behind my head and kissed my cheek. Is that for me? She said, pointing to the flowers. It was a stupid question, but I think she was trying to get me to say something, because I was still standing frozen in place. I replied, holding out the bouquet to her. Thank you, Mark. Please come on in while I put these in water. Mark, this is my son Kevin. Kevin, this is Mr. Miller, an old friend of mine that I went to school with before I met your dad. Kevin held out his tiny hand and said, Hello, Mr. Miller. I finally found my speech and said, Hello, Kevin, shaking his hand. While Jeannie put the flowers in a vase, I looked around the apartment. The first thing that caught my eye was the folded flag in the center of the bookcase. On one side of the flag was a picture of a Marine. Attached to the frame were 2 medals, the Purple Heart and the Navy Cross. That's my father. I looked at the picture on the other side of the flag, Ginny with her husband and baby Kevin on the beach. At that moment, Ginny walked into the room. Ginny, I apologize if something is wrong, but that is a beautiful picture. You 3 look very much in love. You must miss him. No need to apologize. It's very sweet. And yes, we were madly in love. I met him at Northwestern University. He was in the ROTC program, and I was studying journalism. My classmates wondered why I fell in love with a military man. Most of my classmates didn't have much respect for the military. But besides being a strong and confident man, Chuck was the kind of man you could trust. He had a heart of gold. There's that word again. Trust. Ginny's eyes were watering slightly as she looked at the picture, so I broke the silence. Are you still ready for lunch? Yes, we have some catching up to do. Kevin, Mr. Miller is taking us to the Red Robin. Kevin was overjoyed at this, and we jumped into Ginny's car instead of moving the car seat into my rental car. The conversation was more animated during the ride, and by the time we got into the restaurant, the 3 of us were laughing at some silly joke Kevin had told us. Lunch went great. Even though Ginny had gone through so many life changes since we last talked, marriage, a baby, widowhood, she was still the same, kind, smart, funny, and charming. At one point, Ginny asked me why I was in San Diego. I was embarrassed, but decided to tell the truth. I already told you about how I was scolded by both my mom and Hank. The truth is, I came here to apologize to you for the way things ended. You deserved better, and frankly, listening to your stories about your marriage to Chuck, you did much better. What are you going to do now? Are you going back to Portland? My flight isn't until Sunday night. I think I'm going to spend the next couple days at the beach, run around a bit, and try to get my thoughts in order. I've got a lot to think about. Kevin dispelled his boredom by coloring with the crayons the restaurant gives out to kids while the 2 adults went about their business. But after 2 hours, we got fed up and drove back to Ginny's. Mark, do you want to attend a barbecue at my friend's house tomorrow? What? And miss a day alone contemplating your belly button? That's a lot to ask. Ginny laughed. Well, if you change your mind and decide to come to the barbecue with us, pick me up tomorrow at 11. Dress as usual, shorts and a polo shirt. Oh yeah, bring some beer. I told Ginny I'd see her then, kissed her on the cheek, and shook Kevin's hand. As I drove back to the hotel, all the reasons I had loved Ginny during those 3 years in high school came flooding back at me. The next day, Ginny, Kevin, and I went on a picnic. After we parked the car, Ginny took my hand to introduce me to her friends. As we approached a small group of men, apparently Marines, I felt them studying me, and I got the feeling that this picnic was in part a test to see if I was good enough to date Jeannie. The introductions took place, and Ginny left me to make sure Kevin got situated with the other kids. At least that's how she explained it to me. I turned to the group. I hope this isn't a cliché, but thank you for your service. Captain John Clayton answered for the group. Cliché or not, it's always nice to hear. My dad served in Vietnam, and I can see the pleasure in his eyes when we're out walking together. I'm in uniform, and someone thanks me. It's a lot different than what he experienced after he came back from Vietnam. After that, the conversation turned to more pleasant topics, including the male icebreaker that is sports. The day passed quickly. I spent some time with Ginny, some time with the men, and even spent an hour in the kitchen with the ladies, exchanging cooking tips. At the end of the day, I was invited to join the men at a local tavern after I brought Ginny home. Kevin was asleep in his car seat. So, did I pass? I think so, but I'll probably get a call from Doreen after you leave for the tavern, and I'll get another call tomorrow after the men report to their wives. I hope you don't mind too much. They're a close-knit group who take care of themselves. I'll always be a part of them because of Chuck. He and John Clayton were very close in Afghanistan. I held my breath and decided to ask the question that was swirling around in my head. So the fact that I'm being tested means you want to continue dating me? Yes, Mark. We've both changed since our high school days, but I still have something in my heart for you. If you want to keep dating me, I'd be very happy to. I'd like that too, Ginny. Let the testing begin. We laughed, and I remembered how much I loved her laugh. By the time I leave the bar, it'll be late. Can we see each other tomorrow if I pass the tests? Ginny laughed again. I usually go to Mass at 10. You can join me at Mass or come afterward. She looked me in the eye. When was the last time you were at Mass, Mark? Other than funerals and weddings? It's been at least 10 years. I gradually drifted away from the church when I moved to Oregon. I didn't stop believing, I just stopped going to church. We were pulling up to her house. I carefully took Kevin out of the car seat and carried him to bed. As I turned around, I saw Ginny in the doorway, looking at us with a smile on her face. I walked over to her and gave her a hug and a kiss. She kissed me back. I'll see you tomorrow. I'll be here at 9:30. Wish me luck. I walked into the bar and was greeted by 5 men, including John Clayton. What have you got, Mark? I took a quick glance at the taps. Stone could use one. Rodriguez, 1 stone for our friend. The bartender poured me a pint, and the 6 of us sat down at a table. John was clearly the leader here, so he started the conversation. Mark, we're not trying to mess with you, but you have to realize that 3 of us at this table, including me and Roddy, the bartender, owe our lives to Chuck Turner. Did Jeannie tell you anything about that? No, I saw the Navy Cross, so I knew it had to be something special, but I didn't want to get involved, so I kept quiet. Good for you, showing respect. But I'll tell you this. We were patrolling the mountains near Pakistan when we were ambushed by 40 or so Taliban. We couldn't call in an airstrike because that would have caused an avalanche. We couldn't retreat because they would have taken the high ground and outnumbered us. Chuck ordered us to outflank them, and he and Rodriguez stayed in position to pull them close. It took us 3 hours in this rugged terrain to advance behind the Taliban. For 3 hours, Chuck and Roddy kept them at bay. We were able to outflank them, and because of the elevation, we were able to destroy them. But by the time we got to Chuck and Roddy, both were wounded. Chuck had 4 wounds, but he was still fighting. He died in my arms. Roddy was unconscious with wounds to his head and leg. Roddy has a prosthetic leg, which is why he works as a bartender instead of being on active duty. That's why Ginny is our responsibility. At least until someone comes along to relieve us of that responsibility. Someone worthy. I understand, John. Let me answer you this way. Ask Ginny if I've ever done anything disrespectful in the 3 years we've been together. My worst sin was letting her go. But I think it was better for her because she met Chuck and had a son. I didn't have the maturity then to be a good husband or father. I've never touched a woman in anger, even when I caught my first wife with another man. I may not have what you have, the courage to attack men by shooting back, but I'm not a coward either. I won't back down if it means protecting a loved one from harm. I've recently realized I'm a bit self-centered, but I'll work on that. So now that I know how things stand, let me ask you all. I paused to look around the table. Do I have permission to keep seeing Ginny? People might think it was overkill to ask permission to date an adult, but I saw it as a way to show respect for their obvious concern for a fellow widow. I wasn't pretending, but I'm a good salesman because I can read people well. And it was the right request. because the answer I got was a broad smile from John and the others. Roddy, could you get us a batch of good beer? Make it a Knob Creek. Rodriguez brought 7 shot glasses half filled with the amber liquid. John raised his glass for a toast. To Captain Chuck Turner, Rodriguez joined us, and we all took up our glasses and drank. We sat around for another couple hours, drinking slowly to avoid a DUI, but discussing a variety of topics. At one point, I was told why Ginny wasn't seeing anyone right now. John told me about it. Last year, Ginny and another Marine started a serious relationship. The problem was that Jeannie couldn't get into a serious relationship with another Marine, not after she lost her first husband. And Tom had dreamed of being a Marine all his life. Tom told Ginny that he would leave the Marines, and Ginny replied to Tom that if he did, she would never speak to him again. Right after that, Tom transferred to Legend, and from then on, Ginny wasn't serious until she got your letter. Doreen said she called that afternoon and was very glad to see you. Don't tell me I didn't say anything. I won't say anything, but thank you for sharing. The next day, my affair with Ginny began. I racked up a lot of miles flying between Portland and San Diego. Every other weekend I spent with Ginny and Kevin. Hotel rooms were getting more and more expensive, and Jeannie wasn't ready for us to consummate our relationship yet, so John and Doreen were kind enough to put me up in their guest room. At home, I tried my best to work on my social skills. Even my boss noticed the difference in my behavior. I joined the company softball team. In San Diego, I played doubles tennis on the base courts. My partner was Jeannie, and for new partners, we were performing well. This was my 5th trip to San Diego. It had been 3 months since my first visit. I walked out of the terminal and got into Jeannie's car. When I looked back, Kevin's car seat was empty. Where's Kevin? He's at Doreen and John's this weekend. I have a surprise for you. I hope you like it, Jeannie replied as she pulled away from the curb, leaving the airport and heading north on the I-5 freeway. Ginny didn't bother to tell me about the destination, and we talked about other things. She said that Kevin was disappointed that he wouldn't see me until Sunday. He had grown very attached to me. I could tell by the tone of her voice that Ginny was pleased by that. As we drove, I noticed that Ginny was wearing the same blue sundress that she had worn at our first lunch, but this time, there was no bra underneath. We pulled into the La Jolla Beach and Tennis Resort Hotel. She smiled broadly at me. I think it's time, don't you? My answer to her question was a wide, shit-eating grin. As soon as she parked the car, I grabbed her and kissed her. You know I'm in love with you again, don't you, Mark? Thank God, because I've been hoping you'd fall in love since that very first weekend. I love you, Ginny. What a weekend. Ginny and I ordered room service food and entertained all Friday night. It was past noon, time to pick up Kevin, so we headed back to the Cliffs and the Clayton house. John greeted me with a firm handshake and a bottle of beer. Doreen hugged me and smiled broadly. Kevin straddled my legs. We had dinner with the Claytons, and Kevin spent the entire evening by my side. He looked sad as Jeannie drove me to the airport. On the way home, I made my decision. 2 weeks later, we were at the Claytons again for a Friday night cocktail party. When John and I were alone, I told him everything. I'm going to ask Jeannie to marry me, unless you have a reason why I shouldn't. I'll be disappointed if you don't. She's madly in love with you, and I can't imagine a nicer guy or anything that would make her even happier. Does that mean she'll move to Portland? If she says yes, and if she says yes, I'll work on getting us back to Chicagoland. She misses her family, her brothers and sisters. That's great, Mark. I know she's been talking about her family with Doreen. How are you going to handle Kevin? I'm going to take him out to lunch tomorrow and have a chat. Keep your fingers crossed for me. You might be surprised at his reaction. The guy likes you. The next day, Ginny gave me a weird look when I told her that Kevin and I needed to run some errands together, but I got away with it as I justified it by saying that it was time to socialize with the guys. We headed straight to Red Robin and grabbed a table. Over 2 milkshakes, I asked a question. Kevin, what would you say if I asked your mom to marry me? Would that be okay? I held my breath, waiting for his answer. That would be great, Mr. Miller. My mom really likes you. And you, Kevin, do you like me enough to live with your mom and you? Yes. Does that make you my dad? Sort of. No one can take the place of your real father. What did you call him? I used to call him Dad. Then maybe if your mom and I get married, you'll call me Dad. Would that be okay? Kevin smiled sweetly and replied with a short, Sure. We headed back to his house. Two had already left, leaving one left. I thought it would be hard for Kevin to keep our conversation a secret. As soon as we entered the house, I was holding the ring in my hand, and Kevin was carrying a bouquet of red roses. Ginny smiled when she saw the roses, and then looked embarrassed when I knelt down. Ginny, will you marry me? Not very original, but right on point. Ginny knelt down and wrapped her arms around me. Yes, I love you, Mark. That was all I needed to hear. Kevin wrapped his arms around us. Unfortunately, he forgot to drop the roses first, and the thorns scratched my neck. Thankfully, that was probably the worst thing that happened in our years together. Epilogue. I'm not going to drag this out. My life with Ginny has been blessed in so many ways. We were married 3 months after I proposed to her. By then, I had found a great job in sales at a company north of Chicago, close enough to our families and old friends. Kevin now has a brother and sister. They all call me Dad, since that's what Kevin calls me. Ginny still looks amazing after 3 kids. We still play doubles tennis, and please don't tell anyone, but we have learned to play volleyball and have games at Black's Beach when we visit the Claytons. Last May, our family met up with the Clayton clan in Washington, D.C. We did the usual tours, and on Memorial Day, we visited Chuck's grave in Arlington to pay our respects. It was 10 years since Captain Turner was taken from his wife and son. It was a sad, somber, and proud day. I was glad John and Doreen were there to help me comfort Kevin and Ginny. It took all day for the smiles to return, and for a few more days after that, you could see the occasional resentment. But it was the right thing to pay tribute to any person, whether military, police, or firefighter, who volunteers to live their life knowing that one day they will have to sacrifice everything in the line of duty. We returned from our trip, and it's been a few weeks, but everything is back to normal, even the flag, the medals, and the picture of Captain Charles Turner on the bookcase. I am very pleased that Ginny and Kevin allowed me into their lives after such a brave man became their husband and father. As for me, I'm glad I opened my eyes and ears to learn what trust really is. Even Hank has stopped threatening to kick my ass. Although he still gets mad at me when I miss a man cutting off a ball during our softball league game. My excuse is that I'm distracted by a beautiful blonde with 3 cheering children in the stands. My life is good. The end. Thanks for watching. I hope you enjoyed it. So subscribe to my channel and watch the next video.